Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Lawmakers return to Capitol Hill this week, facing pressure to move stalled legislation, navigate internal party tensions, and make progress on must-pass items before the calendar tightens further. We'll walk through what's realistically at the top of Congress's agenda now that members are back in town with Loren Duggan from Bloomberg Government. Loren, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Congress is back in town this week, but before we start with their new work, let's just refresh our memory. What's happened over the last 2 weeks when they were in recess, but apparently not really gone?
Fiscal matters were certainly top of mind because they got the president's budget request. They weren't all here to read it, of course, but they've been digesting that. And they've made maybe some progress on funding the Homeland Security Department, getting that fully open, making sure that everybody can come back to work and get paid. But they still have to finish that work once they return, because while the Senate took the steps it needed to get that back to the House still needs to do its part to get that legislation to the president's desk.
So just walk us through again what those provisions are as they currently set for funding DHS.
So the idea now is that what the Senate passed before recess and then passed again by rejecting the House's counter is to fund everything for the rest of the year for DHS except for Immigrations and Customs Enforcement and the Border Patrol. The idea is there would be a second track moving where those two agencies could be funded, possibly using budget reconciliation, which those are going to be two buzzwords we hear a lot in the coming weeks. Now, that plan has made some people happy. It would be a path forward, but there's not 100% backing for that. And one of the things we'll be seeing as lawmakers get back into town is, will that two-step approach work, or do they need to find another solution?
Walk us through the current state of discussions on reconciliation. One bill, two bills, defense funding, not defense funding. It seems to be all over the map.
It has been all over the map. The thinking that was kind of coming together was one bill, very narrow, just dealing with the ICE and Border Patrol funding. One question would be, how long would you do that for? And also, would that be it? Would they pour more of Homeland Security into that, which is what some Republicans on the House side have called for? The narrower they keep that, the easier it will be to do. But there are these other things out there that they want to do in reconciliation. Like you say, defense funding, the president's request said $350 billion for fiscal 2027 would come through that process on top of regular appropriations. Then you have talk about provisions about fraud in government programs, maybe giving some money to then earn money as you tackle fraud in different government programs. And then there are some who want to use this to advance parts of the Save America Act, that voter ID legislation that was on the Senate floor for quite a bit of time before they left, although there's some challenges there just with the way the budget reconciliation process works. And of course, once you open up a bill like this, a lot of other people are going to come and say, I want this, I want that. Can't you just stick this in here while you're doing it? So that's going to be a big dynamic over the coming weeks.
Well, that's typically the way you find compromise, right? Where you get enough people to sign on to your bill to get it through. Reconciliation limits some of those options.
It does. It has to have a nexus in the budget. It has to have a fiscal impact. If it doesn't, it's not going to be eligible. You can get creative and write provisions, giving some money and putting conditions on it, but it's a very narrow path. The Senate parliamentarian has ruled many things out of order over the years because they don't comply with that. So they will play a key role here. But the whole reason for this is you don't need the 60-vote supermajority in the Senate. You can do it with 50 as long as you can push through and survive the vote-a-ramas of late night vote after vote after vote. So, it's a narrow process, but they've used it effectively before. That's how the tax cuts last year were signed into law, using this process, and they have a playbook that they can try and use again.
Well, let's turn our attention to what they will start to work on. We've talked already about DHS funding and reconciliation. Presumably, those will be early out of the gates this coming week. But there are other bills, lots of other bills that have been left in limbo. So let's maybe pick them off in order. FISA. Where are we at on FISA?
We are rapidly approaching the April 20th deadline to do something about that. The House Republican leadership was hoping to put an 18-month extension of that on the floor, clean, as they say, not major policy changes. But they have a math problem in that if they're going to do that using the rule from the Rules Committee, where they usually need all Republican votes, they may not get that unless they offer an amendment. So that makes it tricky because then you have to deal with that. They could go under suspension of the rules, 2/3 majority, but they may not have the numbers to make that happen. So they're going to have to figure out what pressure they can put, how they can navigate this, because it's an issue that doesn't fall on party lines necessarily. There's sort of a group of House Freedom Caucus members and civil libertarians on the Democratic side who want changes, and then others who are backing the clean extension. So it's kind of an unusual dynamic, but one that leaders will be wrestling with for sure.
I'm speaking with Loren Duggan. He's Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Loren, let's take housing. Both chambers have had dueling housing bills. How are those looking towards a compromise?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the things that they had talked about is maybe needing to form a conference committee where the two sides would hash out things. We don't see a lot of those anymore, but that is the old school way of trying to resolve differences between the House and Senate passed bill that do different things. So we'll see if they can work some things out informally now that they're back into town. There is a lot of interest in housing, obviously, because of its role in the affordability and economic debates that are going on. So we'll see if they can work out some of their differences there. But procedural questions might dominate on that one.
Air safety is another place where they have dueling bills. Presumably they all got on an airplane over the last couple of weeks, so it might be top of mind. What are you hearing there?
The House will likely vote this week on the ALERT Act. That's the bill that was drawn up by the Armed Services and Transportation and Infrastructure Committee leaders as kind of an alternative to what the Senate had sent over that Ted Cruz had primarily authored there. So that bill could get a vote this week. It has a broader range of the NTSB's recommendations after that DCA helicopter crash last year. So if they can get the 2/3 support they need for that, that could move forward. And we'll see if that becomes the bill, if the Senate will accept that.
And of course, since they left on recess, we've had more operations in the Middle East. Where are we on war powers operations, votes, and funding?
I think we'll likely see a war powers vote in maybe both chambers this week. Democrats have the option to try and force those, and as we've seen, they have before. So I presume we'll see those votes. We'll see if anybody has really moved. I think John Fetterman said last week that he wouldn't vote for a war powers resolution on this. He's been on that side, and maybe some Republicans will support it. The prospects of ground troops and certainly some of the X messages and truth messages last week coming from the administration had change some of the tone of some of the statements from Republicans. So we'll see how they feel this week now that there is this ceasefire that's been in place for a few days.
Some members of Congress have said, well, come back and see me after we've been there for 60 days. Why is that 60-day threshold important?
They've often done that before in authorizations where they set timetables that you need to report to us and things like that. I think they do want to see how the operations go. And that was certainly the case in the first round when, if it was a more limited range of operations. So we'll see if any of the dynamics in the last 2 weeks have changed that or maybe changed their thinking. But we've seen the campaign at least propagated in certain ways over the last several weeks.
We've just walked through half a dozen major issues here, but April 15th is tax day, and the IRS CEO, Frank Bisignano, is going to be testifying before Congress on the 15th. What are you expecting there?
Certainly a lot of questions about how the tax season has gone. They had the One Big Beautiful Bill Act last year, or what Republicans call the Working Families Tax Cut. And I'm sure they'd love to be able to get some messages out there about what the refunds were like, how well the tax season had gone, things like that. But he'll probably get questions, too, about how the IRS is faring after DOGE last year and after some of the funding cuts that the agency had and what's going to happen going forward, because not everyone files their taxes by April 15th. People who are getting extensions or who are going through audit processes have a lot to go ahead of them as well. So I would expect a robust back and forth there with people interested in what he has to say.
One more thing to watch as we look at the coming week.
Budget hearings are starting. We talked at the open. The president sent this up, and now cabinet secretaries will be making the journey. We'll be seeing a lot this week and in the weeks to come. So that'll be a very interesting highlight.
I've been speaking with Loren Duggan. He's Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Loren, thanks for giving us the roadmap for all of this work ahead.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.